As we get closer and closer ultimately to the general election, there is a major focus, of course, on key states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But according to guest columnist at Sabato's Crystal Ball, Seth Moskowitz, no relation, by the way, focusing on these states could work for the Electoral College, but might hurt a candidate's party in down-ballot Senate and House races. Seth joins us now via Skype to expand on this and explain what presidential campaigns will have to do to help their respective parties. Great to have you, Seth.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
All right, so lay out your thesis here. Basically, the idea is while these swing states in the Midwest are all important in terms of the Electoral College map, they are not all important in terms of keeping or winning back the House or keeping or winning back the Senate. Kind of lay out the landscape for us.
Yeah, so of course, this November, there are going to be other elections besides the presidential election at the top of the ticket. There's going to be down-ballot Senate and House races taking place all across the country. And the most important factor in these down-ballot races is going to be the presidential election at the top of the ticket, how the presidential candidates fare up there at the top of the ticket. And so because the presidential results are so important for these down-ballot races, the presidential candidates will have an incentive to compete in states and regions that have closely contested Senate and House races, even if they're not in those core Rust Belt states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, because there are a lot of competitive down-ballot Senate and House races all across the country, not just focused on those three states.
So what other states do you think that they should ultimately be looking at?
Yeah, so I kind of separated the country into two regional categories that we know, the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. In the Sun Belt, there are a lot of very competitive Senate elections. The three Senate elections that Sabato's Crystal Ball has rated as a toss-up are all down there in the Sun Belt, and those are in Arizona, Colorado, and North Carolina. There are also some competitive Senate elections up in the Rust Belt, but that take place outside of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and those are taking place in Maine and New Hampshire and Iowa.
And how do you think Democrats' chances are in general of taking back the Senate? I mean, do they have a realistic shot this time around?
Yeah, so the Democrats will need to net 3 seats in the Senate as long as they win the presidency. And I don't really see a way for the Democrats to win the Senate without winning the presidency. I just don't think that it's likely that they're going to be able to win 3 or more seats in the Senate without also happening to win the presidency. So I think the real question is, do Democrats have a shot at netting 3 Senate seats? And I do think that is a possibility, but it's going to be difficult, especially because there is one Senate election in Alabama where Democrat Jug Jones is running for re-election in a state that Donald Trump carried by nearly 30%. And with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket there in Alabama, he's going to have a very tough election. So I think the chances are that Democrats are going to have a tough election cycle if they want to pick up 3 or 4 Senate seats. But if the presidential candidate runs very strong at the top of the ticket and does so in states outside of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, then Democrats do have a serious chance.
What do you all have that Alabama race rated right now, the Senate Alabama race?
The Senate Alabama race is lean Republican right now.
Gotcha. So chances are pretty decent Republicans might pick that one up, although you never know. Obviously, he was able to win it once, maybe able to win it again. Do different candidates in the Democratic primary show strengths in different parts of the country? So, for example, a lot of polls have Biden leading Trump by a larger margin, and then Senator Sanders, and then Warren, then Buttigieg. But I saw a new poll that just came out of New Mexico that had Bernie with a broader margin than Biden. Do you see kind of regional strengths in these candidates?
Yeah, I think that in the head-to-head comparisons with the presidential Democratic candidates and Donald Trump, almost everywhere Joe Biden runs the strongest against Donald Trump. I think that was the case for the New York Times polling. I think that's the case for the Morning Consult polling that just came out today or earlier this week. So I think broadly, Joe Biden does run strongest in those head-to-head polls. But again, those head-to-head polls don't take into account everything that could happen over the next year in the election cycle. It's very difficult to predict this far out how the campaign is going to go and how the different candidates would compete in these different states. There are some different perspectives about how the candidates would be able to run campaigns, because in those Sunbelt states, there are a lot more minority voters. So some analysts believe that if the Democrats pick a minority candidate, they'll be able to turn out those voters and have a higher chance of success at picking up those Sunbelt House and Senate races. But on the other hand, Joe Biden is from Pennsylvania. When he was in Delaware, he was running ads that also were aired in Pennsylvania. So there is a good chance that if Joe Biden was the candidate, he might be the strongest in that Rust Belt region.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen, at least from the primary, much indication that people of color are most enthusiastic about candidates of color. They seem to be looking more at their comfort level with the candidates, their level of trust in them, and their issue positions. How predictive are these head-to-head polls at this point in the race, looking back at previous presidential races?
It's hard to tell. At this point, I think it's too far out from the general election cycle to really say if these head-to-head polls are going to be predictive of anything that could happen in November. But I do think that they do tell you something. And what they tell you is that these polls have forced people to choose between a specific Democratic candidate and Donald Trump versus the generic ballot polls, which say, would you pick a Democrat or a Republican for the presidential election? And I think there is something in forcing the respondents to choose a specific person, not some idea of a candidate or idea of a party for the presidency. So while they are not extremely predictive this far out, I believe that in past election cycles, the past 2 or 3, they actually had the wrong candidate winning this far out from November of election year. I think they do tell you something in that they force respondents to choose between a specific Democratic candidate and a specific Republican candidate.
Right. And on the other hand, and last question for you here, do Republicans have much of a shot at picking back up the House?
I think the Senate, the Republicans' chances of picking up the House are similar to the Democratic chances of picking up the Senate, in that I don't see a way for Republicans really to win the House unless they also win the presidency. I just don't think it's possible for them to run that strongly in those down ballot House races unless their candidate, presumably Donald Trump, runs very strong in those regions and those places where there are competitive House races. And a lot of those are taking place, again, in the suburbs, where Donald Trump has seen his approval ratings drop pretty severely. So unless he can pick back up his approval rating and run strongly across the entire country, because the House races really are scattered across the entire country, I think the chance of Republicans picking up the House is unlikely.
All right. Very interesting, Seth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. We'll have more Rising for you after this.